Hello and welcome to the European Report. We're here in our London studios, and the issues we're going to be discussing today is that the news this week that a Nazi war criminal has died before he has faced trial. And also in the Ukraine, there's been a reburial for Nazi SS officers. So we'll be asking, is Europe returning to the dark days of the 1930s and 40s? And what is Europe doing to stamp out this rise of Nazi ideology again on the continent of Europe? The other issues we'll be discussing in this programme is the EU's new directive to impose economic sanctions upon Israel, upon goods and services that are produced in Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. And we'll also be discussing the state of the Middle East peace talks, as John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, has now sponsored the peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians for the first time in 3 years. My guest for the programme today is Thomas Sandel, the founder and executive director of the European Coalition for Israel, and Dr. Gregory Lafitte, who's an ECI representative in France. So, gentlemen, it's great to have you on the European Report.
Great to be
here. And we're here in our studios in London because the European Parliament studios are in recess in the European Parliament. Thomas, can you share some of the activities that you've been involved in? I know you've had a long holiday in Finland, but some of the activities you're involved in and you're planning since we last did a programme together in the European Parliament, which was at the end of June.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. It's good to be back in London, and rightly, as you pointed out, I'm just returning back from a holiday, from a long holiday, a European holiday, which is a long holiday. But interestingly, the world doesn't stop spinning, although it's a holiday. And in the last 4 weeks, the situation in the Middle East has changed quite dramatically, and some of the issues we are going to deal with in this program. Just to say that I had to come back from my holiday just to respond to this EU directive on imposing sanctions in Judea, Samaria, and East Jerusalem, Golan Heights. So although technically you can be on a holiday, you always have to be on high alert, and this has been a good example of that principle. I've also been able to meet with some Christian leaders, go to Christian conferences, and just explain and share what we do in the European Coalition for Israel.
Excellent. And Greg, it's great to have you back on the European Report. I think we did a programme together this time last year, so it kind of feels like an annual event. So can you share with our viewers some of the work that you're involved with in terms of ECI?
Okay, yeah. Great to be back. Thank you, Simon. And well, it's been an incredible year since last year when I was in your program. Things have changed quite dramatically with the November 29th vote of 2012. So we've been very much active at the UN to try to continue our work of advocacy for Israel, and there is still lots of things to do there. But even if November 29 was quite a sad day for us, we believe that somehow we were able to see a bit better what is the state of the nations today, and now we see things we have a clearer view of where we are at and where do the nations stand. There is still much to do, but there are also some very encouraging things happening with nations wanting to stand with Israel.
And Thomas, I'm going to introduce the kind of first news item, and this is news this week. The suspected Nazi war criminal, his name's Laszlo Kastry. He's 98 Hungarian, who has died in hospital this week before he could actually face trial. According to my notes here, it is believed that he was responsible for the deportation of 15,700 Jews to their death in the Nazi death camps in World War II. Clearly, this is a big issue for Europe. It's responsibility for the Holocaust, but clearly the the families of the victims who perished through his hands, they're the ones that not getting justice in this case. Could there be something more done to actually speed up the legal process to bring prosecution to the remaining Nazi war criminals who are alive today?
Yeah, it's as you say, it's a sad news, and what I would like to point out is the fact that I just read recently that only some 10% of the SS officers in Auschwitz were ever brought to justice. It means that 90% of the perpetrators never were even brought. They were in a trial. And when you look at the bigger pictures and going back to that dark period of European history, you know that many more that will never know their names, or their names will never make the news, are out there, which brings the whole questions in a new light for me. I think the positive things that I would like to mention is the fact that there are some good work of reconciliation that is being done, in particular in Germany, where you have the sons and daughters of the perpetrators who are starting to raise this issue in their families, but not only that, who are practically going to Ukraine, the very nation that we are talking about, to meet with the families of the victims of the Nazis in Ukraine. And what happened only last year, and through a friend of ours, Jobst Bittner in Germany, was that you brought together descendants of the SS officers, the perpetrators, and family members of those who died. And just to see a German, after all these years, coming to Ukraine and say, on behalf of my family, I want to ask for forgiveness. So I think there is a deeper wound in Europe that can never be addressed or put right, even in a court of trial. And as important it is that we do go through with all the legal processes, there is even a deeper dimension into this problem.
Yeah. We've got a news clip to go to now that looks at the 98-year-old Nazi war criminal, suspected Nazi war criminal, that is, before he died before he reached trial. And we've got this clip to go to.
98-year-old Nazi war crime suspect Laszlo Csatari has died while awaiting trial in Budapest. He faced charges in both Hungary and Slovakia for alleged crimes he committed during the Second World War. Csatari was first arrested by Hungarian authorities in 2012 after his case was made public by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a Jewish organization that tracks down Nazi war criminals. The group claimed that he had played a crucial role in the deportation of an estimated 15,700 Jews to the Auschwitz death camp. A Czechoslovakian court sentenced Csatari to death in absentia in 1948 for war crimes. But he had already fled to Canada, where he lived for many years before being stripped of his Canadian citizenship in 1997 and forced to return to his native Hungary.
Welcome back to the European Report. Greg, what do you make of that particular news item, that here is a suspected Nazi war criminal believed to be responsible for the death of over 15,700 Jews and sent them to their deaths in the Nazi death camps of Auschwitz and other camps. And now, because the legal process has been very slow, means that the Jewish people don't actually get justice. Is there some way we could actually speed up this whole legal process to ensure that the remaining Nazi war criminals actually face prosecution, despite the fact they're in their 90s?
Yes, well, I think that's a very difficult question because we don't really see any way to facilitate bringing to justice of suspected war criminals like this man. It is certainly important, I think, for each of our European nations to understand this greater dimension that Thomas just mentioned just before. That somehow we need to repent, first of all, and that I think that would be the best way to somehow bring justice. It's the first step. If we don't even repent in each of our nations, and that's where Germany has a leading role. And as a Frenchman, I must admit that in France we have not much repented, and we have, and it's a difficult thing. And I think that's how somehow it hinders this bringing to the justice of those suspected war criminals.
And Thomas, do you believe that maybe the issue here is the fact that he wasn't brought to trial because the legal process took so long to mount the evidence, to present the case, and then actually to have him put his case forward in his defence that he wasn't a Nazi war criminal, and the fact that maybe there isn't that kind of political sense of urgency because this is a man who was 98 and he's looked at as being a grandfather rather than actually being a Nazi war criminal.
You're absolutely right. I don't think that this issue in any way is on the top of the political agenda, and we have to remember that even the legal process is connected to the political priorities. So I think most European political leaders would sort of like to forget about this dark chapter of history. And as you say, even when you look at a man who we can relate to perhaps as a grandfather, it's for us it's so difficult to think that this was the same man who actually was personally responsible for so many thousands of Jewish people being brought to Auschwitz. So I think the human mind in our time that we are living, we're not able to connect to the realities of the Holocaust, and this is the problem. It's much easier to be soft and say, well, let's just forget about it.
And Greg, earlier you talked about the importance of repentance, and which I think is a very, very good thing, and the reconciliation between the Jewish community and the nations across Europe, and there's many nations, particularly Austria, that probably needs to do the same. But how important is it really for the Jewish people to get a sense of justice? Here was a Nazi war criminal. He may have been 98. He died before he could actually face trial. How important is it that there is a concerted political effort on behalf of European leaders and organizations to ensure that the remaining Nazi war criminals face justice?
I believe it is very important. Unfortunately, it's not something that has been at the top of the agenda. And when you look, while you were asking the question, I was thinking of our late President Mitterrand, who was a friend with someone in the Vichy, the head of the Vichy police. So the collaborators of the Nazi regime, and so how can they be brought to justice if even the president of a nation like France was still friend with the head of the Vichy police, and so. There would be lots of things to be done to try to help the justice come about, and for the Jewish people to see that there is something done on this matter.
Thomas.
And also going back to Germany, we'll have to remember that the denazification process was never complete, and it's impossible, to denazify a whole population. But of course, what is more worrisome is that some of known Nazi officers ended up in future German governments. And even you have some of the so-called founders of the European community at the time, which clear links to the Nazi killing regime. So as Gregory is saying here, again, it's a deeper problem. We're looking at the top of the iceberg, like the top of the iceberg. And I believe symbolically it would be very important that they would be brought to justice. The Jewish people would feel that even if it's long overdue, that justice has been done, but still it remains this much deeper, much wider problem in Europe. And I think some of the tendencies that we see in European society today is a direct consequence of the fact that, we never dealt with the core issues in the first place.
Yeah.
And we've got another news clip to look at, and this is the rise of Nazism in the Ukraine.
In the former Soviet Republic Ukraine, controversial video has surfaced showing the reburial of Ukrainians who fought for an SS division during World War II. And the reburial was sanctioned by church officials and overseen by officials dressed in Nazi uniforms. Ethnic Ukrainian nationalists wore helmets with swastikas and uniforms marked with Third Reich eagles during the service for 16 members of the SS Division Galicia. The ceremony took place in the village of Holohori in Ukraine's western Lviv province. Some veterans were present. During a salute over the grave, costumed reenactors used wartime-era rifles to fire a salute as their leader gave commands in German. Priests looked on, and later in the ceremony, Oleg Pankevich, a member of parliament for the political party Svoboda, which has a faction in parliament, called on Ukrainians to stand up as a nation and to resist outside oppression. The SS Division Galicia is controversial in Ukraine because it was drawn from the west of the country, which is mainly populated by ethnic Ukrainians, many of whose grandfathers fought on the side of Germany during World War II. The east and the south of Ukraine is heavily Russian-speaking, and during World War II, both ethnic Russians and Ukrainians from those regions fought in the Red Army for the Soviet Union. And that is why wartime loyalty remains a political flashpoint in modern Ukraine. Svoboda, which means freedom in Ukrainian, is led by the nationalist politician Oleg Tyanibok. The group has seen increasing popularity in recent years with a political platform of proud Ukrainian nationalism and an end to Soviet-style leadership, crony capitalism, and political corruption. But Svoboda has drawn fire for an alleged unwillingness to admit ethnic Russians and other non-Ukrainian nationalities into its ranks, and for anti-Semitic comments by some of its functionaries. The party has also been criticized for strong-arm tactics, as shown here when Svoboda activists fought with police to break into a Kiev city council meeting they had been locked out of.
Welcome back to the European Report. Thomas, I saw that clip there, and all I can say is I'm absolutely horrified that something so horrendous as Nazism is being celebrated and glorified again in the Ukraine, and having the reburial of, I think it's 16 Nazi SS officials and their whole Nazi ceremony, including church leaders and officials wearing Nazi uniform, is something that I thought that I wouldn't see again in my life in Europe, knowing that this Nazism was consigned to the history books, but it's clearly not. But what is your response to this glorification of Nazism in the Ukraine?
I mean, it's absolutely shocking. This is not the way I want to come back from a long holiday, and I had no idea about this news item that you just brought up. It does raise a number of questions. One is, of course, the fact that next summer, already in the spring, we'll have new European elections, and it is widely believed that populist, racist parties will gain strongly in the new European Parliament. And this is one example of what we see across Europe, in Bulgaria, in Hungary, in Greece, in many other nations, that you have strongly racist parties, and some of them openly neo-Nazis. And of course, I think the case of Ukraine is interesting. I mean, first of all, I want to condemn in the strongest words what we just saw. But you also have this divide between the eastern part of Ukraine, which is more inclined to having cooperation with the Russians, and then you have the western part who wants to be part of the EU. We also have to remember that the fact that one part is off the track, it doesn't mean that the other is completely on track. And I think we also on this program needs to remind ourselves of a part of European history which spells Soviet-style communism. And I think in Ukraine you have a polarization on the one hand, where you have those who want to go back almost to Soviet-style communism, and then you have those who try to counter that influence by going completely off board and into, again, the darkest chapters of European history, and it's terrible either way.
Greg, I mean, we saw in that shocking news clip there that church leaders were involved in this reburial of Nazi SS officers. Are these Ukrainians actually aware of what the Nazis did during World War II, responsible for killing over 6 million precious Jewish lives, and also sending Europe and the world into a global war that killed over 240 million people. So what is your response to that clip?
I found it horrifying. I didn't think that was something still happening today. You know, it makes me think. I used to live in Provence, and when I went to live there, I realized that there was a concentration camp just where I lived, and it was called Le Camp Les Milles. And no one had told me about it, and the reason was that we tried to hide it in France, and we only discovered it existed at the beginning of the 80s. And so I think those church leaders, I don't understand, you know, how can they do such a thing? But I think us Christians, where we live, I think we should again not try to hide what happened, and again repent and ask the Lord forgiveness, and because it's horrifying to know that something like that happened where you live. So I don't know how those Ukrainians, what they understood of what happened there, but I understood what happened where I lived. And to see those tracks of those train tracks where the wagons would go to Auschwitz from Les Milles, and to see those tracks not far from where I lived, I could see them from my house. It just showed that we need to remember, and we need to not hide what happened, but remember and ask for forgiveness. And that's, I think that's the important thing for us in Europe, is not to hide what happened.
And Thomas, what do you think we're seeing this resurgence and reemergence of Nazism and neo-fascist groups that are emerging in Europe, and we're also seeing, sadly, in our day, a rise of anti-Semitism that we haven't seen since the 1930s and 40s?
Yeah, I think we've said this a number of times on the program. Of course, anti-Semitism goes a little bit, up and down, and I think I saw some figures for this country which implied that it was a bit lower this year than last year. But overall, and especially if we are looking into the Central and Eastern European countries, we know there is a tremendous rise. The fact that you would have openly Nazi sympathizers voted in parliaments in Greece, in Hungary, in Bulgaria, is something that I would never have thought when we started this coalition only 10 years ago. You also have Nazi sympathizers in the European Parliament. And as I said a few minutes ago, we can expect to have more of them 1 year from now. Why this is, the conventional explanation is of course to point at the financial crisis. There are similarities to what happened in the 1930s. We again hear these talks about the Jews controlling media, the Jews having all the money. Of course, I'm from Finland, and in Finland we have a very tiny Jewish community, less than 1,000 people. But you have, and it's interesting, there's this one company that have a free newspaper, which basically is trying to sell their goods, but they also have columns there. And one of those columns have been it's the Simon Wiesenthal Center that has raised awareness that the language is the same as in the 1930s. And this is in the middle of nowhere in Finland, in the north of Finland. So if it can happen there, where they don't even have any encounters with the Jewish population, it can happen anywhere. And I don't think it can be explained in any scientific terms. It has to be spiritual. I would call it demonic.
Yeah, I think that's the best description we can call it. It's just pure demonic and should never be accepted or tolerated. Gregory, what measures do you think the EU can actually do to not only stamp out anti-Semitism, but also to confront this new rise of neo-fascism and Nazism that we're seeing popping up all over the continent of Europe?
Well, I think the answer is education. It's important that the EU continues to hold remembrance days concerning the Holocaust, and ECI has been very much involved in that, and but also education. It's important to continue to talk about the roots of anti-Semitism and how what were the people saying at that time in the 1930s, for people to see that things have not changed, unfortunately, that we're hearing the same things again today. So I think education is what the EU can do. Apart from that, I don't really know. And the EU is working on this, and several other organizations like UNESCO has a strong program on this.
Very often we have reasons to commend the European Union, European Parliament. I'd like to do it now. The President of the European Parliament, who is German, Martin Schulz, has been a very strong advocate for preserving the commemoration of the Holocaust, but also what he said during the first year of his presidency was to say, in the European Parliament we will not allow for Holocaust denial. What he said this year again is to say, well, when we hear people, racists, who are openly anti-Semitic or denying the Holocaust, I will, as the president, I will point to the door and say, well, there is the door. There can be no room for anti-Semitism in the European Parliament. And I think for once I do feel proud, to be a Finnish citizen, but still a member of the European Union, when this attitude, which is much stronger than what you will find in the United Nations, or even in the US, where the freedom of speech, of course, is so important. So I think with examples like this, when you have one of the leading politicians in Europe being so strong on the issue, that's something I feel rather good about.
And this is another issue we're going to raise up, and this is the latest EU proposal to bring about economic sanctions upon Israel on goods and services that are produced in Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. And we've got a news clip to go to on this issue now.
The recent decision by the European Union to stop funding projects in the West Bank has come only a month after the decision to mark products which have been manufactured across the so-called Green Line. Will all these steps really hurt Israel financially, or are those just publicity stunts by the Europeans to appease the Palestinians? We went to ask some of our experts what they think about the issue. For Alon Liel, who was the Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's no doubt that if the EU boycott will be implemented, it will have disastrous effects on Israel.
It has a huge effect on Israel, simply huge. If I try to compare it in the magnitude, I can only compare it to the November 2012 UN Assembly resolution to recognize Palestine as a state. And because this is a decision dealing with the content of the negotiations. This is a decision that is reminding the Israelis and the world that there is a 1967 line. And the main battle at this stage in the negotiations is if it will be based on 67 or not based on 67. And Europe says simply it should be based on 67. So it's huge. It's bigger than the labeling issue.
Davidi Pearl is the mayor of Gush Etzion, which incorporates 20 settlements in what is known as Area C of the West Bank.
It's more of publicity act than really affects us. And I think maybe it's much more dangerous to the world than the act about the sign produced, because when you say something like this, in my view, you didn't learn the message from the Holocaust. You don't understand what's been the anti-Semitism that is going around the world. At the end of the day, you're pushing us to be alone in the world, and we have to stand by ourselves and don't rely on the European Union or other organization.
Economist Dr. Ruby Nathanson of the think tank Macro agrees that the effect of the boycott on the Israeli economy is going to be negligible.
The impact from the economic point of view on Israel, it's very little, I would say. It is not such a big deal what is produced there. Most of the people living in those settlements, they work in the big metropolis anyway, in Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv area. So to say that these industries in the occupied territories are not the main source of income of the people living there in any case. And from those products' point of view, or producers' point of view, they have other alternatives and other markets as well. I mean, the proportion of the European market in Israeli export is getting down during the years.
Alon Liel claims it's not a new thing that Europe feels they are the moral compass of the world.
I think Europe sees it as a moral issue, as a human rights issue. I agree that Europe has bigger problems today, but this is not something that popped up just now. The issue of settlements, the issue of what is described in the world as the Israeli occupation is an issue of 5 decades now, and things are being accumulated. Israel is a strong country. Israel can respond, especially against some individual European countries. I don't think Europe is gaining financially from such a decision. They might even lose from such a decision. So there is a moral standing here, and I think the Palestinian lobby has a part in it, but it is walling without the Palestinian pressure already. There are enough countries in Europe that have it high on their own agenda.
Dr. Ruby Nathanson admits talking morality is nice, but the real reasons for the European behavior lies in their financial interests in the Arab world.
The Arab countries in general, they have a huge impact on European policies and big and influential lobbies and also economic interests of Europe in Arab countries and vice versa. So the Palestinian issue in that respect is from the European point of view not only a question in principle, but also has to do with the interests of European countries in good relations and economic cooperation with Arab countries. There is a big economic interest in dealing with the Palestinian issue, not that they care about the situation of the people living in the West Bank, but they care much about their business in the Arab world, and the Palestinian issue is a sensitive issue which is part of the agenda in the Arab world.
As the new EU regulations won't take effect until next year, there are still members of the Israeli diplomatic community who believe the ruling might still be reversed before it will start to be implemented.
Welcome back to the European report. Thomas, I did a Middle East report special on this whole EU proposal to bring about economic sanctions upon Israel, which has really taken Israel by surprise. What is your response to this latest EU directive that looks to impose economic sanctions on goods and produce that are produced in Judea and Samaria, the Golan Heights, and also East Jerusalem?
Well, this is exactly the reason why I broke my holiday and I had to write an opinion editorial for the Times of Israel. My original headline was EU, an obstacle to peace, because I think it illustrates so well how, whereas John Kerry has been very constructive in bringing the two sides together, here at exactly the same time, I think within 24 hours more or less, the EU comes out with a completely destructive measure. And there's so much that could be said. And I think what we have to point out is, and I think one of the gentlemen here in the clip said the same thing, this may not hurt, financially speaking, Israel that much. The people group that it will hurt the most is the Palestinians, knowing that there are some 60,000 jobs which are occupied by Palestinians in these territories. Well, what will happen if this boycott will go into action is that they will hurt, they will suffer. And who will care for these 60,000 Palestinians plus their families once the ramifications are known? I also think it's just again an ugly reminder of the European past, where we are trying to define where Jews can live and where they cannot live. And I think we are faced with two scenarios or two visions of peace. One is the vision, the vision of Abbas, which is basically backed by the European Union, to say that a new Palestinian state will be a state without any Jews, a Judenfrei state. And he said it just some 2 weeks ago in Cairo. There's been no comments, there's been no criticism from the international community. And on the contrary, what the EU is doing, they're just using a diplomatic language, but they're saying the same thing. They said, you know, listen, these are people who are illegally there, they shouldn't be there, they should be evacuated, and a future Palestinian state should be Judenfrei. I think it's terrible. It's completely terrible.
And Greg, I want to bring you in on this one. Is this because Europe has lost her moral bearings? That because Europe has so much departed away from our Judean Christian heritage, there is no biblical connection anymore with the land of Israel, with the continent of Europe, and so therefore they feel that they can sacrifice Israel, and also they want to impose a Palestinian state on Israel by refusing and also trying to determine Israel's borders that are actually outside of the main peace negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, situated in the legal framework of the Oslo Accords.
Yes, it really comes at quite an incredible time. I mean, some are trying to do a positive work of bringing the two parties together around the negotiations table, and some are just trying to come up with a proposal to boycott, which really is, there's no way it can be implemented. So it doesn't make any sense, and it just hinders the peace process, and so it really doesn't make any sense, and it just shows it just reminds Israel that what they've known for a long time, that the EU is not really a friend, and so it's just a reminder for Israel.
Yeah, two additional comments, perhaps. I think it's quite worrisome when the Israeli President Shimon Peres, he was trying to be very diplomatic, but he told the Europeans clearly, please, whatever you do, stay out of the peace process. So that he is saying he's very sympathetic, generally speaking, towards the Europeans, but he can just see that they're not being constructive at all. No, I think yes. It should be said that the timing was very bad. I mean, you had all the parliaments in Europe going on holiday. There was no one who could really react or discuss or debate it. But nevertheless, there were a number of very high-profile European politicians who already distanced themselves from this directive. And you have, in particular, two Germans, Elmar Brok, the chairman of the European Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee, who said that Europe actually needs Israel more than Israel needs Europe. And I think the fact that this comes from his side is something that the Europeans will have to take into considerations. If we are going to break cooperations with the Israelis or make cooperation more difficult, it's Europe that will hurt.
No, I couldn't agree more, particularly considering that Israel, compared to its size, is the second largest food producer in the world, second only to the United States. So there could come a day when the whole Europe needs Israel, particularly for food
technology and oil and natural gas.
Absolutely. So look forward to that day. But Thomas, I mean, we're talking about legally, the legal rights of this latest EU directive. It surely goes against the conventional legal framework of the Oslo Accords, which was set up by the United States between Israel, the Israeli government, and the PLO back in 1993, and we saw that with the signing of the peace accords between the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat of the PLO. And it stipulated that the two sides would come to a political agreement and settlement on some of the major issues. So what gives Europe the right and the moral authority to impose a political and legal situation on Israel when it's really down to the two sides to determine the borders and determine if there's going to be a Palestinian state, the size of a Palestinian state, and what would actually constitute?
Yeah, I think it's a power game, like always in politics, and the European Union don't want to be left aside, and it's always so embarrassing for the European Union that they are the largest contributor to the Palestinian authorities, paying 500 million euros per year, but they have very little political capital in the region. So I think, again, they are rather desperately trying to get into the game. And as it was said in the clip, the Europeans think they have a moral compass to tell the Israelis what to do and what not to do. But I couldn't disagree more.
And Greg, according to my notes here that I said previously in the programme, the Israeli government was very, very much shocked. It shocked the Prime Minister's office as well as that of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the decision to boycott Israeli goods and services. Also, now Israel's responded by organising 1,000 legal experts from Israel and around the world to submit a letter to the European Union's policy chief, Baroness Catherine Ashton, refuting claims over the legality of this process. What is the best way, do you believe, or maybe Thomas can chip in as well, that Israel can fight this latest mad EU directive?
Well, I think the best way for Israel is to realize that who are the friends and who are not so friends, and so I think that the best way for Israel is to try to make friends with nations, a number of nations. And I mean, we're doing the European report, but there's not only Europe in the world, and a number of nations are wanting to stand with Israel. And I think Israel should realize this and try to make friends with them, especially on the African continent. It's becoming more and more obvious that some African nations would like to stand with Israel and would like to stop being in just a big group always going against Israel, but they understand that it's in their interest to stand with Israel, and with their religious convictions sometimes they would like to be able to stand with Israel. So Israel doesn't only have enemies or people that are always trying to impose things, regulations like the EU. There are also some nations who would like to stand with Israel.
And we've got to encourage that. Thomas, so for some of the supporters of ECI and our viewers as well, how can we respond to this challenge of this latest EU directive, and how can Christians get politically active in the defence of Israel to fight against this hideous and unjustified ploy to impose economic sanctions upon Israel?
Yes, I think there are two levels that I would like to mention. I think one thing which is very important, you rightly mentioned these 1,000 legal scholars. I think most of them would be Jewish, and rightly so. And you asked the question, what can Israel do? I would also ask the question, what can we do? Well, as you're doing now, to say that the responsibility is with us. We have to speak up. We have to do what our fathers and mothers and grandfathers and others did not do in the 30s and the 40s. And now there's no better time to do it than now. So one, we have drafted our own legal arguments, which will be presented in Brussels as soon as they return from their recess. But also anyone, all of us are politically part of a constituency, be it here in Britain or another European country. We have members in the European Parliament, members in our national parliament, and we can make our thoughts known to them. It's not only a right, it's a duty in the political process to send them an email, to send them a letter and say, we are very concerned about this development. We don't feel that Israel is being treated correctly. If they want legal arguments, they can go to our website and they can subscribe to our reports, and they will get the arguments, the political language that members of parliaments understand. So what I'm saying is, yes, there are those who are called to go into governments, into parliaments, but all of us can pray, all of us can be active in sending our emails, our letters to our representatives in the parliaments.
No, exactly. And I know that many of our viewers have actually written to their MEPs and have had some very good responses. So I want to thank you for those of you who've done that and also told me that you have, which is you making a big difference for Israel and the Jewish people. So keep it up. Thank you. The third issue we're going to look at today is the start of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. These are the first time that talks have started for over 3 years, being sponsored in Washington by the US Secretary of State, John Kerry. And we've got this clip to go to now.
Peace talks are set to resume in Washington this evening between senior representatives of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. The resumption of talks has been credited to an intensive period of shuttle diplomacy from U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. The new talks were made possible after the Israeli cabinet approved the release of 104 Palestinian prisoners, whose freedom was a Palestinian precondition for fresh negotiations to begin. The last talks in 2010 broke down over a dispute about Jewish settlement construction in the West Bank. Despite both sides agreeing to come back to the negotiating table, it remains unclear how far the U.S. is willing to go to broker a deal, which will need to address the core issues of borders, Jewish settlements in the West Bank, the fate of Palestinian refugees, and the status of Jerusalem.
Welcome back to the European Report. Thomas, this is the first time that direct peace negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians have started, particularly due to the industrious work of the US Secretary of State, John Kerry. Now, does this mean because the peace process has started again, which is being supported in Washington, D.C., that the Palestinian threat of unilateral independence, the UN, is now off the table?
Well, Simon, we don't know. We'll have to wait until the last week of September to really know what's in the minds of the Palestinians. But I think it's important for us to point out that, of course, we are happy that the two parties are sitting down together to negotiate. This is what we always said. This is what we said at the UN last year, that, there should not be unilateral actions. The two sides should sit down together and negotiate. Of course, having said that, there are a number of issues which are problematic. Just to mention one, the fact that Israel still is only negotiating with one fraction of the Palestinian people, that is Fatah, the Palestinian Authority. And even if in the unlikeliness that there would be peace with the Palestinian Authority, we still have the other part, Hamas, which is in no way interested in peace talks, which still has on its agenda to wipe out the Jewish state altogether. So I think we should bear in mind these things when we go into the peace talks.
And Greg, I want to bring you on this one, that Israel's paid a high price, haven't they, to actually enter into these talks. That they've had to release 104 Palestinian prisoners, and many of them with blood on their hands, responsible for the death of a lot of Israelis, including, I think, a foreign tourist and Israeli soldiers. In one particular case, one of these individuals that was released was responsible for throwing a Molotov cocktail at a car, killing people on board. So the cost for Israel is very, very high. But what are the Palestinians doing in terms of bringing something to the table?
Very good question. I'm afraid not much. We would. It's not a not fair negotiations, especially since it's supposed to be without preconditions. But there's always has been preconditions. Just by always repeating the 1967 borders, which were not borders, but always repeating this, and it is really a precondition that the Palestinians are putting through this. And I would just like to add something concerning your previous question. We don't know if the Palestinians will stop their unilateral bids at the UN. And John Kerry is very much aware of that, because every time he has tried to make it happen, to make the peace process back on track, he always repeated that we need to be quick, because to try to prevent the Palestinians from returning to the UN and trying to do it before the general debate of the next session of the General Assembly. In the opening is in September. So everyone knows that the Palestinians are going to try again to do something at the UN, because they saw that it works.
Thomas, a certain question comes to mind, particularly with John Kerry's obsession in trying to reignite the peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Is this the right time that he should invest so much diplomatic and political capital on the peace process when the Middle East is in flames? I mean, we've got Iran on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons. We've got a civil war in Syria that has already cost the lives of over 100,000 Syrians and caused a refugee crisis of 1.5 million. There's the crisis in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, and now the military have come to power thanks to 30 million Egyptian people saying we don't want political Islam. And trouble with the Arab Spring as well as Libya and Benghazi. Is this the right time to put all his focus on the peace process?
I think you have basically answered the question yourself, and I would agree with you to say that this is not the right time. This should not be the priority in the Middle East right now. I think for Israel to rush into something, not knowing, how things will be in Egypt only 1 year from now, how will things be in Syria only 1 year from now, it would be foolishness to put anything into cement. I think, but this should be the requirement from the international community to say, well, let's the dust settle and then see where we are a few years from now. But this is not the time to rush into anything. And I don't like this talks of a deadline here or there and say, well, this is the last chance. It's not. And obviously, I think if you even speak with the people in the Gulf states and other Arab leaders, they say, well, there are other problems in the region right now.
Gentlemen, we're down to the last 2 minutes of the program. Now, one thing I think we have to do really is mobilize Christian public opinion throughout Europe to stand with Israel and the Jewish people, and also get young people involved in what I call one of the great calls of our time. What's the best way that people can get involved politically on behalf of Israel?
Well, I think it's simple, and we had a good friend from Canada, a political activist, who just said it's like the minister simply showing up. It's not rocket science. I mean, we all have a vote, we all have a voice, we can all express our opinions. You can either do it, as I said earlier in the program, by simply sending letters to your local representative in the parliament. There are those who I believe the Lord is calling to go and see them and to speak up, and others who will join us or other organizations to do it in a strategic and a coordinated way. But I believe this is absolutely the time to act, the time to speak up.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's European Report from our studios here in London.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you all for joining us on this European report from the Revelation TV studios in London, because the European Parliament is in recess. So we'll be back in the European studios next month in September. So I want to thank you for watching. But let's raise our voices. Let's confront the rise of Nazism that we're seeing across Europe. Let's defend Israel against these awful imposed economic sanctions. And let's let the Jewish people and Israel know that they're not alone. So thank you for watching today's European report.